This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. As we approach the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King, two historians of the civil rights movement assess his legacy. Professor Julian Zelizer reviews the complicated relationship between King and LBJ, and he also has some thoughts on current presidential politics as well. Historian David Chappell reassesses the civil rights movement, noting that after King, there developed a false trajectory. And Latina activist Eileen Truax tells us about her book featuring young immigrant dreamers. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Julian Zelizer is a Princeton scholar of Lyndon Johnson as well as the civil rights movement. He says civil rights activism is no longer as organized or coherent as it was when it sought and won passage of the Voting Rights Act. And we say hello to Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. Also the author of the book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Julian Zelizer, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Much has been said about the accuracy of the movie Selma. As someone who has chronicled those years in your new book, did President Johnson take an undeserved shot by the filmmakers?
I don't know if it's an undeserved shot, but I don't think the filmmakers captured how committed Johnson was to voting rights by early 65. The fact is, after he's reelected in November of 64, Johnson tells his Attorney General-to-be, Nicholas Katzenbach, to draft a strong voting rights measure so it's ready to go. In February of 1965, a month before Selma, Johnson is having his people negotiate with the Senate leaders over a voting rights bill. And the main difference that Johnson has with Martin Luther King is when to propose the bill. Should they move immediately or move later? And that's not the kind of difference that I think comes across in the movie if you don't really know much about the period. So I think there are problems with the portrayal, but it's still a phenomenal movie. And I urge people to see it to understand how the marchers in Selma were able to put pressure on Congress to act sooner than Congress was willing to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, since LBJ and Martin Luther King were partners in winning passage of the Voting Rights Act, does it really matter who said and did what along the way?
I think it matters to John. It matters just in terms of understanding the history. That's certainly important. And it's important to understand where a president stood on the important issues of the moment, whether we're watching this through a movie or whether we're reading it in a textbook. But it also matters in just understanding how the civil rights movement had transformed public opinion and political opinion by 1965, which was really a huge accomplishment. They had moved the nation through protests, through encountering the violence of the South, to the point where the President of the United States was standing behind this legislation, even if he was not yet ready to push it forward. And that matters too. And finally, for Lyndon Johnson, I think a lot of people who study his presidency, it's been decades where most of the discussion is about Vietnam, and now we're turning back to his domestic accomplishments. So I think a lot of either supporters of his or students of his presidency want people to understand really the very significant domestic legislation that took place during this period, and they worry that the movie might give you the impression that this was not really central to his presidency.
Now, given Johnson's political origins as a segregationist and the difficulties he had with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the 1964 convention, wouldn't it be understandable that civil rights leaders in 65 might have been a bit wary of him?
They were. They were very wary of him throughout. They never knew exactly where he stood. Many were always suspicious that really he was a conservative in liberal clothing. That said, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, even with what happens at the Atlantic City Convention, there are still many civil rights activists, including King, who believe this is the real deal, that this is a president, despite his Southern background, who's willing to invest a lot of political capital in pursuing these kinds of bills. So even when that suspicion lingered, even when there were parts of the civil rights movement that in the end wouldn't trust Lyndon Johnson, there was a huge contingency that thought he was more liberal than any president they had seen on race relations, including John F. Kennedy.
You made this point a moment ago about the movie depicting historical tensions between presidents and grassroots supporters who want to push further, and that's good. You raised the question as to who makes history, political leaders or political activists. So what is the answer?
They both do, but I do, in this book that I just wrote, one of my major arguments is that presidents are limited in terms of power, and ultimately it takes grassroots activism, and it also takes big elections like we saw in 1964 to create moments in Congress where presidents can get things done. And the whole theme of my book is that if we focus too much on presidents and focus too much on what the quote-unquote great man is able to do, we miss how important the environment is and how that environment in Washington can constrain any president, even one as savvy as Lyndon Johnson. So Johnson really depended on the grassroots. He depended on the electorate to give him a Congress that had been gridlocked for years that was finally willing to pass legislation.
We're speaking with Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and he is the author of the book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Is pressure from activists now going to push President Obama where he had not gone before on issues like the economy, the environment, immigration? Do you see that happening?
Well, I think the moment is off. So, the thing about the pressure in the 1960s, it was very organized, it was very powerful early on, and it culminates with this 1964 election that gives Lyndon Johnson these huge liberal Democratic majorities. Whereas now, the kind of activism we're seeing right now is taking place in an era when you have a Republican Congress, an obstructionist Republican Congress, and there's going to be limits at this point to how much the activists can do. I also don't think we have the kind of activism we saw in the 1960s, which was just, in terms of numbers, it was huge. In terms of leadership and associations, it was very organized and very coherent. And I don't think we have that kind of pressure right now on the Congress to help Obama through. So I don't think he has the same kind of assets on the ground right now that will be useful to him.
It almost seemed like we were going to get close with Occupy Wall Street in this regard, but every time you saw footage on it, or if you happened to be in an area where some of this activism was going on, there were signs for everything you could think of in terms of what people were fighting for or protesting against. Is that the type of focus that or is it the type of focus that people need? Do you need to pick one subject and not 50,000 different things to protest and rant about?
I do think there's something to that. I mean, coming back to Selma, what's remarkable is how the activists all focused their attention on the issue of voting rights, but then connected the activism through people like King to a very specific piece of legislation that they wanted Congress to pass. And so even with what became very chaotic on the ground in terms of the violence that they encountered, there was still this bill they were talking about, and they could build pressure for that bill. They could get media attention for this issue. And I do think if activism just means almost everything at once, it's harder to get the kind of political momentum that you saw in the 60s. Even the anti-war movement against Vietnam was pretty coherent in its focus about what war it was protesting and what it wanted to bring to an end. And I'm not sure we've seen that in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Is there any precedent for a two-term president who lost both houses of Congress in his sixth year to be as bold as President Obama is now? I mean, does he have a chance of accomplishing anything, or is he, just kind of having fun? Doesn't have any pressure on him at this point.
The odds are low. I think even on the Republican side, Dwight Eisenhower tried to really campaign for a balanced budget in the late 50s after Democrats had control of Congress and liberals had made these great gains in 1958. And he didn't get really far in trying to cut domestic spending. Currently, Obama, he does have executive power, and he's showing that if he wants to use that, he can make some gains. But it's going to be very difficult for any kind of legislation like he saw early in his presidency when Democrats controlled Congress. It's not simply that Republicans have control. It's that the Republican Party is not open or not feeling any kind of political pressure internally to compromise. So there's no electoral dynamic pushing toward bipartisanship. There might be some legislation that passes, but you're not going to have another New Deal, you're not going to have another Great Society, and you're not even going to have what Obama had in those first couple of years.
Looking ahead to 2016, you've written that Hillary Clinton needs to be challenged by Elizabeth Warren. Why?
I think it's good. I mean, one of the flaws in Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2008 was a bit of too much comfort and unwillingness or not feeling the necessity to really test out arguments and to demonstrate exactly what she was about because of this inevitability that she felt, which ultimately was knocked down. Now she's not really going to have a challenger unless someone like Warren steps forward. And I think it would actually be good for her in the primaries. I think it would help her build her electoral muscle. It would help her sharpen her arguments so she's ready for the general campaign. And I think there's something valuable to the fight of a primary to get ready for the general election. And I think in many ways she would come out stronger rather than weaker.
Is there any risk to splitting the party like we seem to see on the Republican side, though?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the Democrats are very determined to win the White House for another term because they understand they need to protect the programs that President Obama has built. So that means come general election, even if there's divisions within the electorate, I think the unhappiness with the Republican Party and the determination to win the White House would bring that party together. Look, 2008 was incredibly divisive for Democrats, and more than I think a Warren-Clinton campaign would be. And in the end, the Democrats put President Obama in office.
Okay. Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. The name of the book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Julian, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Historian David Chappell explains the post-Martin Luther King trajectory of the civil rights movement, which he says may have been only a historical artifact with King as a central figure. And we'll talk to him more about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
And away we go, off on another crazy cruise with Ted. Cinch up your seatbelts, for Senator Ted Cruz, fueled by his flaming jet-powered ego, has gotten a head start on all the other wannabes seeking the 2016 Republican presidential nomination. And what a crazy start Ted made, launching his campaign from Liberty University. It's the creation of the late Reverend Jerry Falwell, the self-promoting Christian theocrat, bigot, liar, and buffoonish pretender to be God's chosen agent on earth. Cruz hopes that launching there will make him God's candidate, the chosen one of far right-wing Christian extremist voters. But good Lord, Falwell? The vast majority of Americans remember him as an unholy fool, a nonstop spewer of hate. I listen to feminists and all these radical gals, he said. These women just need a man in the house, that's all they need. Then there's this piece of vicious sermonizing. AIDS is the wrath of a just God against homosexuals. Likewise, the pompous preacher said 9/11 was, quote, what we deserve. claiming it was God's punishment for feminism, gays, the ACLU, and other evils. His knowledge of African Americans was equally insightful. The true Negro does not want integration, he explained. Also, in Jerry's world, there is no separation of church and state. All public schools will be closed and taken over by churches, and Christians will be running them. And the Bible is absolutely infallible, even in areas such as geography, science, history, etc. This is Jim Hightower saying, you can't stand in a hog wallow without getting stink all over you. Yet, crazy Ted Cruz deliberately chose to stand in Falwell's political wallow, leaving him reeking with the stench of Falwell. Is Cruz running to be president of the USA or of Liberty University?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Historian David Chappell talks about the post-Martin Luther King trajectory of the civil rights movement, which he says may have only been a historical artifact with Dr. King as the central figure. And we say hello to University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell. He's the author of a new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. David Chappell, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's great to be back.
Yeah, nice to have you with us. You say in your book that most people don't think there was much of a central narrative or rhythm to the civil rights movement after Martin Luther King. Was there one, or did civil rights progress in fits and starts?
Oh, I think I think we see a kind of false continuity or trajectory. As the years from the Montgomery boycott in 1955-56 through the Voting Rights Act and the Selma March in 1965, we see a kind of simplistic trajectory from crisis in the streets to confrontation at the national level and resolution with radical history-making legislation. And, that's the movement itself was never that predictable, and people never felt, that they were on a straight track of progress towards those victories. There was a lot of luck, a lot of contingency, even during those heyday years of tremendous victories and surprising victories. So I think, in a sense, the post-King years that I write about in my book are not really that different from the years of King's heyday, in that history is always kind of messy and unpredictable and hard to trace. It's just that without a central figure to help us oversimplify events and developments, the post-King years are, maybe we're more frank and realistic in our ability to see it as disjointed and unpredictable.
Is the civil rights movement a historical artifact now with Dr. King as its symbol?
I think it is. I think it's also a very real thing, and I think it continued disjointed and moving, hither and thither, lurching in different directions, as it clearly did after King's death, after the 1960s. I think it's very real and very realistic to speak of a movement with an ever-churning and evolving population of rank-and-filers in the streets. I think it's nonetheless something that people feel, and rightly feel, they're a part of. They're a part of historical precedents and legacies, and they are very rightly, self-consciously, taking up an agenda, taking up items of unfinished business that their predecessors, including Dr. King, believed passionately in.
You dwell on the book on some of Dr. King's successors. Chief among them is Jesse Jackson. How do you assess his role in the history of the movement?
Well, I wouldn't say he's chief among Dr. King's successors. There's certainly a period there in the mid-1980s when Jackson is gobbling up a lot of the attention, and the media, as they had previously elevated Dr. King and perhaps oversimplified the movement by making King appear to be a singular symbol of it. Jackson is fulfilling King's legacy or stepping into those shoes. But I think that there are many leaders and organizations that are carrying on King's legacies. There are many moments when projects like the National Black Political Conventions in 1972 and 74, about which I have a chapter in my book, the Crusade for Full Employment legislation in roughly from 1974 to 1978, which Jesse Jackson is a part of, but by no means the most prominent part of, and by no means the most prominent leader of. The campaign for a Martin Luther King holiday, which again Jackson is a part of, but I think a distinctly minor part of. Those episodes are moments when the legatees of the civil rights movement, the people who want to keep the flame burning, aim for radical, history-changing national legislation and institutional change, structural change in the politics and economics of the nation, and those are vital moments. And in those moments, the question of leadership itself is very much in play. Back to the National Black Political Conventions of 1972 and 74, especially. A lot of people who organized those, black elected officials and civil rights leaders, are saying that we have to get away from the idea that one national leader can or should represent this vast population of diverse political and economic interests, what we now call the African American population. There's no reason why you'd have one black leader. Nobody expects white America to speak with a single voice. And it's interesting to me that, in a way, the racism of the country helped sustain the idea that there's just one voice of black America, even when it's coverage in the media that's sympathetic to the civil rights movement and sympathetic to Dr. King and Dr. King's agenda, which sometimes the coverage was. It's still a reductive, racist impression that that Black America is speaking with one voice, and I think it's a mark of the success, ironically, of Dr. King and all the people that he has come to represent. It's a mark of their success that's really no longer tenable. That Jesse Jackson, even at his strongest moments, could never plausibly be seen as the leader of Black America the way that Dr. King could be.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell. He's a scholar of the American civil rights struggle and author of a new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. David, a lot of younger listeners might not realize that Dr. King faced a good deal of opposition in his later years to his anti-war stance and his growing militance about confronting the government about poverty. Do you think he was on the right track when his life was cut short?
Well, certainly the issues that he targeted are issues that have remained with us and remain unsolved. The problem of poverty, and I think people who take that issue seriously see racism as integrally bound up with the problem of poverty in this country, though, of course, it's a problem that also transcends race and today, as in King's Day, the majority of poor people in this country are not African American. I think that it's very important to recognize that King had fierce opposition in his day, not just at the end of his life, by the way, but all through his life. And not just from the people you'd expect, the Southern conservatives, the out-and-out racists and segregationists, but a lot of liberals, and a lot, not just white liberals, but black liberals also thought that, he had a Messiah complex, that he was a loose cannon, that he was pushing too hard, demanding too much too soon. He was too radical, and that he'd only provoke backlash. All of these criticisms dogged King throughout his public career from the mid-1950s until he was gunned down in 1968.
You write also about Dr. King's personal failings, namely adultery and plagiarism. Do you think any of that has really tarnished his overall reputation, though? No.
I talk to people, even professional historians today, and, people who you'd think would remember these things. A lot of people can't remember the huge controversy in the early 1990s over the discovery of evidence, irrefutable evidence that King had plagiarized significant parts of his work when he was in graduate school at Boston University, including his dissertation. That whole agonizing public discussion just seems to have been forgotten. And I go through it in the book, looking for some explanation as to why it hasn't had much of an impact on King's legacy, on his national reputation. Some opponents of the Martin Luther King holiday did attempt to bring those discoveries, those revelations about King's academic dishonesty to bear on the debate. And, it might have helped the opposition in some states for a while, but the King holiday, the trend, first with the final passage of the national legislation in 1983, and subsequently every state at one time or another having some version of a statewide King holiday as well. That took a lot longer. But, people to this day celebrate, most people, there are some exceptions, celebrate and honor King on his national holiday every year. As for the revelations about his adultery, it's a more complicated case in many ways. People do tend to remember that. They don't necessarily have a very strong opinion about it, perhaps because we've had so many revelations about so many other prominent national figures, extramarital adventures, shall we say. And I think that, Americans tend to yawn or, their eyes glaze over in such discussions. But I think it hasn't really damaged King's reputation, and I think it's an interesting phenomenon given, again, how controversial, how widely and deeply feared and hated he was in his own day, that when that stuff wasn't publicly known, when, a few people knew about the adultery, but it wasn't publicly discussed. It was not publicized until the late 1980s. And nobody knew about his plagiarism except perhaps Dr. King himself. He has become, as sometimes happens with leaders who are shot down mid-career, mid-stride, he became, pretty quickly much more honored and respected and even loved. The opposition to him dwindled and finally evaporated. I think we had a strong resurgence of it during the national battle over the King holiday and some of the state battles in states like New Hampshire and Arizona, where resistance to the state holiday remained strong. But, again, after those last gasps of it, it ultimately did die down, and it just isn't considered respectable in polite company to, or certainly in the national media, to denounce King personally, or to claim that he consorted with communists, or to raise those. I think it's considered somewhat crass or impolite to bring up his personal failings.
Mm-hmm. All right. University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. He is the author of the new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we look forward to doing it again soon.
Oh, you're most welcome, Jim, and thanks very much. Great to talk to you.
Great talking with you as well. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Latina activist and author Eileen Truax says immigration reform should not be a political issue because it's really a human rights issue. And she tells us about her new book about young immigrant dreamers. And we say hello to Eileen Truax, originally from Mexico. Eileen is a journalist and immigrant currently living in Los Angeles. She is the author of a new book called Dreamers, An Immigrant Generation's Fight for the American Dream. Eileen Truax, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. As we speak, America is at a turning point on the issue of immigration. Do you think President Obama's decision to effectively allow the dreamers whom you write about to stay in the country, do you think that's going to stand?
I think it may stand for a while. We don't know how longer after the 2016 election. As we know, an executive decision can be, it won't last until another president or another executive decision comes around. But the most important thing here is that we have to think about this kind of decisions, of actions, as not permanent solutions. Very clearly, these executive actions are looking for certain temporary relief for a limited amount of people, while the Congress or the authorities in charge are looking for a permanent, a real solution for the immigration problem. When we talk about an executive action that is going to last for 2 years and that can be renewed in other 2 years, that gives certain relief, but it's not really legislative action that can give a path to citizenship or that can give even a green card or a permanent or temporary residency. We are talking that we are just putting a little Band-Aid on a problem that has been there for a long time. So, yes, this may be good for a certain amount of people. Yes, this may stand for a while, but it's far from being a real solution.
Mm-hmm. Is the president's decision, whether it turns out to be legal or not, is it enough for those who would like to see even more liberal immigration laws and regulations?
Well, certainly it's not enough, and I'm not sure if being liberal or conservative has much to do with this. I think we may start switching the way we see things, because if we talk about immigration always thinking about an agenda, this is a liberal agenda, this is a more conservative agenda, and we have elections coming, we are always putting the immigration and the people that are affected by these laws in the middle of a political debate. Maybe it's time to switch a little bit and start looking to that, to immigration and to the people that are affected by the lack of an immigration reform as a human rights issue. Beyond liberals or conservatives or partisanship or elections, we have to think about 11 million people that are here, that are part of our community. And if we think about the American country, American people, like caring people, like people involved with their community, and we know 11 million people in our community are in a limbo, in a situation that they're living here, they're among us, they're part, their children go to the school with our children, they're part of our communities. This goes beyond liberal or conservative agendas. We have to ask ourselves if this will be enough for those who care about other people in our communities and in our country.
We're speaking with Eileen Truax, journalist and author of a new book called Dreamers, An Immigrant Generation's Fight for Their American Dream. What is the general feeling, Eileen, among Latinos, documented or otherwise, toward President Obama's, given his work to reform immigration policies, while at the same time deporting hundreds of thousands of people?
Well, clearly there's a great disappointment. We have seen in the last 6 years the highest amount of deported people, 400,000 a year. That's the highest that we have ever seen in any government. So there's a disappointment, but also it's a contradiction because you have like these two sides in the same agenda. In one side, they're telling you, okay, I'm going to announce this executive action that it's going to temporarily allow you to stay in the country so you can go out there safely. You can look for a job. If you are a dreamer, you can stay here, look for a social security number, can work. You can have a work permit, but not your parents. So maybe tomorrow you're going to come home and you're going to find that your mother or your father is deported. So you cannot say that you're protecting people if you're not protecting a whole family. We have to think that for every person that is affected by certain immigration regulation or the lack of it, there's a family too affected. And sometimes these families include mixed status families. So we can have U.S. citizen children that are being affected by these regulations because their parents are undocumented, or we have seen families with siblings that have mixed immigration status. So you have to take a look to the whole picture when you're talking about protecting a certain group, because, well, that's not enough. You cannot give a blanket to one person of the family and leave the other them out in the storm, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, you say that we shouldn't look at the issue in terms of the 11 million undocumented immigrants, but in terms of each individual and his or her story. Is that because most Americans would be more supportive of a path to citizenship if only they knew what people are going through?
Yes, I'm totally sure about it. I've been a journalist, an immigration journalist in the U.S. for 11 years now, and my experience has shown me that. I'm going to give you an example. As you remember, recently we had this event in Murrieta, California, this town close to the border, where a bus with undocumented immigrant children traveling by themselves or just with their mothers were transported to an ICE facility. And if you remember, there was a large crowd in the town, Murrieta, trying to stop the bus, and they actually were successful on that, and they made the bus return. And they were yelling very nasty things to the children, going in that bus, go back home, we don't want you here, you're bringing diseases. And a few weeks after that, I went there and I talked to some of the people that organized that rally. And by talking to them, I realized there were not bad people or people that don't want children or do not respect other people's lives. They were just very disinformed. When I started talking to them, I realized that they didn't know a lot of things. For example, if you live in Honduras or you live in Guatemala, you are not allowed to apply for the visa lottery in the U.S. So they were very surprised. They told me, okay, they cannot go to the U.S. consulate or U.S. embassy and ask for a visa to come to the country legally. No, they can't. They cannot come here to work legally. They cannot get a tourist visa because most of the time they're not going to give them that. So they were really, really surprised about it. They didn't know that. That's just a brief example about, and then you start telling the stories. You know, I met this girl. She was in a detention center. Then she was transferred to a safe place, and she was 14, and she came all the way from Honduras looking for her father. When you share that kind of story and also share the facts, you find out that people can make a more informed decision, and sometimes the decision is not going to be as tough. It's just a matter of putting a face and a name on these numbers that we normally hear too, but sometimes we don't imagine who are besides that, what are the stories, what are the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can only imagine that seeing somebody face to face and, you know, being able to talk to them about it would probably change a lot of views amongst Americans. You know, your book is a series of case studies, people climbing what you call their own little Everests. Can you give us an example or two of some of the success stories or would-be success stories?
Yes, of course. I tried to focus in this particular cases precisely because of that. I think that giving you a name and a particular story says more than a bunch of numbers and studies and all the information that normally you get from politicians. But, you know, I have these stories. I'll share a couple with you. But the fact is that there's a lot of stories around, and it's very easy to find them. Nancy Landa, for example. Nancy is portrayed in the chapter 4 of my book. And, her case is very interesting. She came to the U.S. undocumented with her family when she was 9 years old. She grew up here in California. She went to college. She graduated with honors in California State University of Northridge. And then she started working. She became an activist. And she was very successful professionally. And when she was 29 years old, she was deported to Tijuana in Mexico. She had a deportation order, and they arrested her one day at noon, and by 8 p.m. this very same day, she was deported in Tijuana, Mexico, a country where she knew no one. She had no one left. All the family was here in the U.S. She spent all of her life here in the U.S. So you are alone by yourself in a very dangerous city. It was 2009, and Tijuana was one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico by that time. And she had nothing with her, just $20 and a cell phone, not speaking Spanish, and not knowing anyone, with no place to go. And she started over when she came to the U.S. She has to learn the language. She had to incorporate to a new community, to go to a school, to do everything new in a strange place once. She did it in a very successful way. And when she went back to Mexico, you can imagine how frustrating can be that, to be in a place that you don't know. They say it's your own. You don't even speak the language. And in the book, I tell the story, and I tell you how did she manage to start over there. But she became very successful too there. And she now she went to study a master's degree in the United Kingdom in London. She just graduated on global immigration. So she's a woman that is very strong, And unfortunately, in the U.S., we didn't have a space for her. We invested a lot of our resources, giving her education, giving her strength, and now he has take all of that to another place, and she's a very successful person. But as I mentioned, this is just one case, and it's remarkable, and the story is very compelling. But you can see these small Everest that I say, little conquers every day, just around. When you are a citizen of the U.S. and you live your regular life, we take for granted the fact that we can drive a car, that we can go to college, that we can get a job, that we can get medical assistance. And we don't think that there's a lot of people that are not able to do that. And they have to keep going with their lives. So every decision that they make during the day has something to do with the fact that they are undocumented. In the morning, you have to go to school, and you are going to college, and you have to go to school. Are you driving? But you don't have a driver's license, so they may stop you, and they may cut you, and you may end deported if you run with bad luck, or if you live in a state that has another kind of law, a little more tough. If you don't drive, then you have to take 3 buses, so you have to run because now it's late. Every decision that you make during the day has something to do with the fact that you are undocumented, and every success that you have, it doesn't matter how little it is like a little Everest because it took the best of you to get there.
We are speaking with Eileen Truax. She's a journalist, also the author of a new book called Dreamers, An Immigrant Generation's Fight for Their American Dream. Eileen, the president said recently that immigration reform is an issue, like many others, that could turn out much better if only people would vote. Latinos in the 2014 midterm elections apparently did not increase their share of the overall vote in some states gave a very large number of votes to Republicans. Do you think the Latino vote can or should be in favor of Democrats, given the Republican Party's opposition to the DREAM Act and the president's executive actions?
Well, we definitely need more Latino community participation. We need more information. We need more education. And also we need more Latinos not only voting, but running for office, running for a seat in local assemblies, in local congresses, in many positions. This is a vicious circle. If you give education and information to your community, it's more likely that you're going to have a leader coming out from that community. If we deny the access to education to certain population, to certain ethnic groups, even to undocumented groups, it's not going to be likely that they're going to become leaders in their own communities. But besides that, I think this is not only a Latino issue. When we think about voting in favor of Democrats or Republicans, thinking about the DREAM Act or an immigration reform or the undocumented community, of course it affects Latinos, but also affects other kind of population. We have undocumented communities coming from Asia, coming from other countries. And also, I think we have to start thinking about it not as Latino, Democrats, Republicans, but as Americans. This is an American people's issue. When we think about education, when we think about healthcare, when we think about the economy, considering any of these aspects for making our mind when we are going to vote, we do it as American citizens, as people living in this country. It doesn't matter much at the end of the day if it's a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative, the one that is making that legislation, as long as that legislation is going to help you to have a better life and it's going to help your community to thrive. It's the same case for immigration reform. I don't think that specifically Latinos, but all voters in the country should take a look about who's offering a better solution, a humane solution for the problems that we have now, whether it's immigration, whether it's healthcare, whether it's any other issue. Particularly in the case of immigration, we have to start thinking about it as a human rights and a social justice issue. We have to try to stop thinking about Democrats or Republicans or about politics or about economy or about safety in the border. Those are things that are related to immigration, but are related also to many other aspects. But immigration is about lives, it's about families, it's about communities. If we look around, we know a person that may be undocumented, or maybe in a family that have undocumented members. And as I mentioned before, they're going to the school, their kids are going to the school with our kids. They're out there maybe preparing our food. They're out there being part of our community. So I think this goes beyond politics, if you're Democrat or Republican.
Much bigger than all of that. Eileen Truax, journalist and author of the new book called Dreamers, An Immigrant Generation's Fight for Their American Dream. Eileen, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You are quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Julian Zelizer, David Chappell, and Eileen Truax. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.